The basement of Michigan Central Station holds 3.5 million gallons of water. It has been holding it for decades, seeping through broken windows, pooling across foundation floors 3 feet deep, freezing solid every winter into a vast underground rink. Urban explorers found it in the 1990s and did what people do when they find an ice rink inside a ruined cathedral. They played hockey. Beneath the 18-story tower, once the tallest train station in the world, strangers skated across the frozen wreckage. Presidents had passed through this hall. Soldiers had marched under its ceiling. Immigrants had arrived here at the height of Detroit's power. Now, it was an ice rink. For 30 years, no trains arrived. Water did. In 2024, Ford Motor Company spent $950 million to make it something else. The restoration reopened a quarry that had been silent for 30 years. Craftsmen carved 11,000-pound limestone capitals by hand. Crews restored ceilings untouched since 1913 and pumped grout through nearly 9 miles of fractured stone to hold the building together. It is one of the most ambitious building restorations in American history. This is not the first time Detroit has staked its future on this building. When the station opened in 1913, it was a declaration that the railroad age would never end, and that Detroit's ascent was permanent. For 40 years, that belief held. Then the trains thinned. The departures increased. The promise fractured. What collapsed next reshaped the city. Now, 111 years later, Ford is tying the station to another transformation. Autonomous vehicles, electric mobility, a re-engineered future that has not yet proven itself. On December 26, 1913, flames consumed Detroit's downtown train depot at 3rd and Jefferson. The fire started at 2:10 in the afternoon, and within hours, the building that had served Michigan Central Railroad for 29 years was a smoking shell. Thousands of passengers were already holding tickets. Trains were already scheduled. The city could not pause. 3 miles southwest, in the neighborhood called Corktown, stood a building that wasn't quite finished. The waiting room stood unfinished. Offices were empty shells. Painters were still on ladders when the decision came. But it had platforms, and it had tracks. And at 5:20 that evening, the first train departed, bound for Saginaw. The station that would become Detroit's Cathedral was rushed into service 6 months early, baptized by crisis before it was even dedicated. The architects who designed it, Warren and Wetmore, had just finished Grand Central Terminal in New York. Michigan Central was meant to be Grand Central's spiritual twin, another Beaux-Arts monument to America's railroad age. The building rose 18 floors above Roosevelt Park, taller than any train station in the world. The waiting room stretched 230 feet long, with 54-foot ceilings held up by massive Corinthian columns. Tennessee rose-colored marble covered the floors. Guastavino tiles, terracotta blocks interlocked without mortar, each one relying on compression instead of steel, formed vaulted ceilings strong enough to hold their own weight for more than a century. Commuters never saw the engineering. They only saw the height. Bronze chandeliers hung from coffered arches. The tower held more than 500 offices for the railroad's business operations. Michigan Central was not infrastructure. It was permanence made visible. And for a time, it seemed true. By the 1940s, over 4,000 passengers moved through Michigan Central every day. Immigrants stepping off trains from the east saw the waiting room first. Its marble and bronze and soaring spaces promising that America delivered on its reputation. Soldiers left for 2 world wars through those platforms, boarding troop trains under the coffered arches with duffel bags and orders they couldn't discuss. Henry Ford passed through these doors as well. 12 miles downriver, his River Rouge complex was already turning out automobiles at a scale the world had never seen. Those machines would begin thinning the passenger lists inside this station long before anyone admitted it. In 1959, Interstate 75 cut through Detroit, a 6-lane scar through the urban core that made driving faster than any train could manage for local trips. The suburbs sprawled outward along the new roads. Commuters who once filled the waiting room began arriving alone, behind windshields. Passenger traffic dropped year after year. By the 1970s, the grand waiting room that once held thousands of daily travelers saw a fraction of those crowds. Mostly elderly passengers, people without cars, travelers on routes that hadn't been cut yet. Amtrak took over passenger service in 1971, consolidating routes, eliminating schedules, cutting routes, shortening timetables, and shrinking what had once been a national web of steel. Michigan Central, built for an age when trains were the future, watched that future arrive in the form of automobiles rolling past on the expressway visible through its own windows. On January 6, 1988, the last Amtrak train pulled out of Michigan Central Station. The locomotive cleared the platform at the station that had defined Detroit for 3 generations, rolled past the Roosevelt Park facade for the last time, and did not come back. Amtrak relocated its Detroit service to a smaller facility on Woodward Avenue. The building went dark that day and did not come on again for 36 years. The Maroon family, owners of the Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit to Windsor, purchased the property in 1995 for an undisclosed sum, with vague plans for restoration that never materialized. And then, the building began to unravel. Water poured through broken windows and pooled across marble floors. In winter, it froze. In spring, it expanded, cracking plaster and twisting structural wood. Copper wiring vanished, stripped and sold by the pound. The chandeliers disappeared. Marble panels were pried loose. On the roof, soil gathered in clogged gutters until trees took root and grew 10 feet into the sky. And below it all, the basement filled. Detroit watched. Its most visible building rot in full view, less than a mile from downtown. Impossible to miss from the Lodge Freeway. Impossible to ignore in any conversation about what had gone wrong with the city. Photographers from around the world flew to Detroit specifically to document America's most famous ruin, climbing through broken windows to shoot the waiting room ceiling with trees growing through it. In 2009, the City Council ordered the Marowns to tear it down. A structural engineering report had cited portions of the building as dangerous. A lawsuit filed by preservationists blocked the demolition order, citing the station's 1975 listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Michigan Central stood, decaying, unresolved. It had once waited for trains. Then it waited for restoration. Now it was caught between demolition and preservation, protected by a federal listing that prevented the wrecking ball from finishing what neglect had begun. The building that had been engineered to last centuries was surviving at this point entirely on a technicality. Bill Ford grew up in Detroit. His great-grandfather, Henry Ford, had built the automotive empire that made Detroit the wealthiest city in America, and whose automobiles had reshaped the city in ways the station was never designed to survive. By 2017, Bill Ford was executive chairman of a company that needed to reinvent itself. Electric drivetrains were replacing engines. Autonomous prototypes were already logging miles on public roads. Mobility startups were testing subscription models instead of ownership. Ford needed a place to develop these technologies, and Bill Ford kept coming back to the same answer. Not Silicon Valley, not Ann Arbor, Detroit itself. Mayor Mike Duggan had an idea ready for him. Michigan Central Station had become shorthand for Detroit's collapse. A building so famous for its decay, it appeared in Eminem music videos and disaster films. The Maroons had agreed in 2016 to secure the building and replace its windows. Duggan approached Ford with a proposition. What if the most famous symbol of Detroit's decline could become the symbol of its renewal? The building Ford executives toured in early 2018 was barely a building anymore. The basement held those 3.5 million gallons of water. Most of the Guastavino tiles had fallen. The steel roof had nearly collapsed. Needles littered the floors. Copper, fixtures, and fixtures wiring were gone. What remained was structure. Bill Ford saw something else. The Beaux-Arts craftsmanship could not be reproduced at modern cost. Corktown was beginning to revive around it, and the symbolism was unavoidable. Restore the ruin, and you restore the narrative. On June 11, 2018, Ford Motor Company announced announced it had purchased Michigan Central Station for $90 million. The building would anchor a $950 million project to create a 30-acre innovation district. Ford would restore the station and use it as a centerpiece for developing electric and autonomous vehicle technologies. Startups would work alongside Ford engineers. The first floor would be public space, open to everyone. Detroit would get back one of its most important buildings. Ford would get a symbol that announced it was betting on the city's future, and on a technology future it believed was coming fast. The first crews that entered Michigan Central Station in December 2018 didn't restore anything. They pumped. 3.5 million gallons of water sat in the basement, more than 5 Olympic swimming pools. The pumping took weeks. After the water came, 3,990 cubic yards of debris, collapsed plaster, broken tiles, rusted metal, 30 years of decay hauled out in dump trucks. Then the building had to dry. Foundations saturated for decades release moisture slowly, about 1 inch per month. Engineers waited, monitoring moisture levels, while architects documented every surviving surface. The exterior limestone presented an immediate problem. Michigan Central's facade was built from a specific type called dark hollow rift, quarried in southern Indiana, with a distinctive gray color and diagonal cross-grained striations that couldn't be matched by any currently available stone. The quarry that produced it, Dark Hollow Quarry, had closed in 1988, the same year the station closed. On Staley, the project's historic preservation lead, had to reopen a quarry that hadn't operated in 30 years. The owners still held the land. When they closed, they had left thousands of limestone blocks stacked in the woods, intended for projects that never came. Trees had grown up around them. The access roads had deteriorated. Staley's team rebuilt the roads, cleared the trees, and began extracting stone that had been cut more than a century earlier for projects that never came. The most intricate work went to master stone carver John Goodrow Sr. He received a 21,000-pound block of dark hollow limestone with instructions to recreate a Corinthian column capital for the main entrance. The original had deteriorated beyond recognition. Working from historical photographs and measurements, he carved from the outside inward, slowly removing mass until acanthus leaves and volutes emerged from solid stone. The work took 428 hours. When he finished, the capital weighed 11,500 pounds. It was lifted into place at the north entrance, one piece among thousands, each one critical to making the building whole again. Inside, of the 29,000 Guastavino tiles that formed the vaulted ceilings in the waiting room and grand hall, roughly 1,300 had fallen or been destroyed. The remaining tiles were original, installed in 1913. Restorers cleaned each surviving tile, fabricated replacements for the missing ones, and spread 8.7 miles of grout across 21,000 square feet of ceiling. Some of the grout was feather painted to blend with the original surface, erasing the boundary between tiles installed in 1913 and those made the previous week. 3,100 workers cycled through the project over 6 years. June 2024, Michigan Central Station looked better than it had in 1913. The limestone facade was clean and complete. 600 tons of dark hollow rift stone, some of it quarried decades before the station was originally built, fitted back into place block by block. The waiting room's Guastavino tile ceilings were whole for the first time in a generation. The marble floors that had recorded a century of footsteps gleamed under the light of 3 recreated bronze chandeliers hanging exactly where the originals had hung before scavengers took them. Ford scheduled the reopening for June 6, 2024. A concert in Roosevelt Park, the green space that had faced the station's facade since the day it opened. Diana Ross headlined. Eminem performed. More people than had probably ever gathered at Michigan Central at one time, even during its peak in the 1940s. Detroiters who had grown up with the ruined station as part of their skyline walked through the waiting room and stood in spaces their grandparents had stood in. The building their city had written off for 3 decades was magnificent again. Some of the workers who had been on site since 2018, who had pumped the basement, hauled the debris, waited for the concrete to dry, walked through the finished building, and didn't recognize it. Some of them cried. What the building is now is harder to define than what it was. The train platforms are sealed off, permanently for now, though Amtrak has discussed returning passenger service without committing to a timeline or a budget. The tower floors designated for Ford workers are occupied, but it numbers well below the 2,500 Ford initially projected for the campus by 2028. The autonomous vehicle and electric mobility technologies the campus was purpose-built to develop have proven more difficult than the industry predicted, not just for Ford, but for every company that entered the space. Ford reported electric vehicle losses exceeding $4 billion between 2023 and 2024 alone. The startup incubator housed next door in the former Detroit Public Schools book depository, New Lab, with over 600 people working across roughly 100 companies, represents the collaboration Ford envisioned. But the technologies those companies are developing are still in testing phases. The future this building was restored for has not fully arrived. The campus is real. The work is happening. The verdict is open. In 1913, Warren and Wetmore designed a building for a railroad age at the exact moment that railroad age was approaching its peak. The station was magnificent, the bet was rational, and the future arrived exactly as expected for 40 years before it didn't. In 2024, Ford restored that same building for a mobility future it believes is coming. Electric, autonomous, connected, transformative. The restoration is magnificent. The logic behind it may be sound. The question is whether this moment will align with the market the way 1913 briefly did, or whether Michigan Central, rushed into service once by fire, restored once by corporate vision, will again outlive the timetable it was designed around. The limestone is clean, the chandeliers hang, the marble gleams. Michigan Central Station has waited before. It knows how. The building that survived demolition on a legal technicality, that hosted hockey games in its flooded basement while the city debated its fate, that stood for 36 years as America's most photographed ruin, is now the most expensive restoration project in Detroit's history, and it stands once more at the edge of a promised future. Whether that bet holds is a question this building will answer slowly, the way it answers everything, in stone, over decades, on its own timeline.